Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to the ESCP webinar on newly transitioned e-leaders in the COVID-19 virtual team context. My name is Tania Fernandez, and I'm in charge of marketing and communication at the Madrid campus. I would like to present our speaker for today, Professor Dr. Petros Chamakiotis. Petros is an associate professor of management at ESCP Business School in Madrid and the chair of the IFIP Working Group 9.5, Our Digital Lives. He earned his PhD from the University of Bath, and before ESCP, he was in the University of Sussex. Petros specializes in how technology influences the practice of management, and he has a specific interest in the management of virtual teams, e-leaders, and online communities, among others. He publishes his work primarily in information systems and management journals, as well as in practitioner outlets like the LSE Business Review. During this webinar, there will be opportunities to ask any questions by positioning them on the question window, or you can actually raise your hand and we can answer them on the go. So we encourage you to participate so that you can take the most out of this webinar. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. I leave you with Professor Chamakiotis.
Thank you very much, Tania. Thank you everybody for being here today to attend this webinar. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can all watch the slides. And here we go. Okay, assuming that the slides work fine for everyone. This is the webinar that I prepared on the issue of leadership in the COVID-19 context. So as you can tell from the title, it is about people that have been working as leaders for a long time in the pre-COVID-19 era, but they had to transition due to COVID-19 into e-leaders. So we're going to be explaining in a few minutes what these terms mean. Before we begin, this is a summary about myself, who I am and why I'm an appropriate person to talk about this issue. So as you can see on your screens, I'm an associate professor of management here at ESCP. I've been here for a couple of years. And before I was in the UK at Sussex, at Royal Holloway. And before that, I was at the University of Bath, where I earned my PhD as well. This is my contact information. You can see that there's my email appearing first, my Twitter handle, so you can get in touch on social media too, my LinkedIn, my web profile at ESCP, and also I have accounts with all major academic web places like ResearchGate and Google Scholar. So feel free to connect with me if you have any questions after the webinar, irrespective of whether you're attending it synchronously or maybe later asynchronously on YouTube. So a bit of housekeeping. Tania already said that we're going to have questions. Microphones and attendees' cameras are automatically off, as it is the case with webinars. And you should feel free to type in your question if you have a question as I talk, or you can keep it for later for the Q&A session. You can also raise your hands, in which case Tania will give you access to raise your question by voice. If anything is unclear to you, feel free to say it, and I will be happy to clarify, and participation in any form is strongly encouraged. This is all about housekeeping for the time being. Let's see what the objectives of this webinar are, and later we're going to proceed to explain how we're going to achieve them. So first objective is to understand how the nature of virtual working has changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, what are the new virtual team configurations and characteristics? Here, we're going to be arguing that virtual teams have been around for a very long time, for over a couple of decades. And here we see ourselves working in virtual teams because of the lockdowns that we have experienced in the last year and a half. The issue is that virtual teams in this context are different to virtual teams in the pre-COVID-19 context. So we're going to be exploring how are they different, what are the configurations, and what are their characteristics. What does this mean for newly transitioned e-leaders? And this is going to be the focus of the webinar. then what should be the priority areas for those that have transitioned from being traditional leaders to being e-leaders of virtual teams, so the newly transitioned e-leaders? And then what is proposed that they should do? So we're going to have a set of practical recommendations as well. This is about what the webinar is about. The next slide is about why do we study this. So we're going to be studying this because of the transition that we have all experienced from what we used to call the traditional / physically co-located working environment, which was essentially work as we knew it traditionally. For example, a lot of people in an office working together and being able to see one another in a face-to-face manner. So that used to be the traditional working environment. And now we find ourselves in a new type of remote / virtual working environment in which things are slightly different. For some of us, maybe not so much, but for others that were not accustomed to be working virtually, maybe this raises significant challenges, let alone for those who have a leadership and management responsibility for their team. So this is the webinar driving question. What does this mean? What does this transition mean for newly transitioned e-leaders? This is going to be the focus of the webinar. How we're going to achieve this? We're going to talk about theory and concepts. So in an effort to explain how the theory that exists out there about those issues, leadership, e-leadership, and virtual teams in particular, can be used to inform what happens currently, what is happening with COVID. We're going to be bringing in some practical and actionable examples in the form of propositions at the very end, and then we're going to have a Q&A discussion at the end of the webinar. So this summarizes what we're going to be doing, why we're going to be doing it, and how we're going to be achieving it in the next maybe 40 minutes or so. Let's begin with some important definitions so that we know that we're talking about the same things when we use specific terms. One such term is that of virtual teams. Virtual teams, you will see that I use the acronym VTs to avoid having to write it in full every time, are essentially teams of dispersed individuals. What do we mean by dispersed individuals? People that are based in different locations, so they could be geographically dispersed. People that may be based in different continents even, so that raises the issue of time. And those same people could be temporarily dispersed as well because they work in different time zones. And lastly, organizationally dispersed. So this means that maybe we have people from different parent organizations working in the same team and forming part of the same team environment. So irrespective of the way in which individuals are dispersed, one core characteristic of virtual teamwork is that members of virtual teams are somehow dispersed. That's one thing that we need to keep in mind. The second one is that they work toward a common organizational task or a project. So what this tells us is that individuals working in virtual teams, they are essentially part of a team. It's a team task, be it an organizational task or a project, in the case of a project team in particular. And how do they do that? They do that with the use of what people call digital technology, what in the literature is known as information and communication technologies, also abbreviated as ICTs very often. And this is the actual enabler of this type of arrangement known as a VT. So this is how we define VTs. And then how do we define newly transitioned e-leaders? A newly transitioned e-leader is a person who pre-COVID-19 was a traditional leader, a leader in the traditional physically co-located environment in the office, to put it this way. But because of COVID-19, they had to work from home, essentially, and they had to transition, to use the word that I use on the slide, into e-leaders themselves. What this means is that people that had leadership experience from the co-located environment may not have had sufficient or any experience of leading remotely dispersed individuals. So the challenge is, how do they lead virtual teams, since they don't have the experience, or they didn't have the relevant preparations for, or training, if you like, for it. So these are important definitions for this webinar. And let's explore a little bit the background in this field of research. Why do we have virtual teams in the first place? There are two essentially reasons why virtual teams have developed over time. And one such reason is for expansion and globalization purposes. Back a couple of decades ago, we knew, and this is still the case now, that companies and firms and organizations need to develop a competitive advantage and to become more competitive. So what they did is they reached out to people across boundaries, to people in other continents, for example, to attract global talent and to use the 24 hours in a more effective manner. So this is the primary reason, if you like, chronologically at least, why virtual teams were initially formed, or why they became so popular 10 or 20 years ago. So on one hand, we have this type of a virtual team, virtual teams, and then on the other hand, we have virtual teams that we see now as a result of the pandemic. And here we say that virtual teams are not developed, and they didn't emerge because of by choice, but instead they were put together for survival purposes, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible for many organizations to survive if they didn't transform themselves from traditional organizations to virtual organizations. So here we see that depending on the driver, we may have a different type of virtual teams. The challenge that this poses is that depending on the driver, we may have different characteristics. So different virtual teams are configured in a different way based on what drove them in the first place. What does this configuration look like? I have here two columns, one in the left, one in the right. And in the left one, we explore traditional pre-COVID-19 virtual teams, what their configuration looked like. And as you can see from in the top row, we have global virtual teams. Back then, or in the last maybe 20 years, we have mostly seen global virtual teams. Whereas now, in the right column, we mostly see local virtual teams of organizations that are maybe in the same city, and yet they have become virtual organizations composed of a lot of virtual teams. So in the past, virtual teams, or we can also call them GVTs for simplification purposes, used to be temporary. So they were formed on the spot for a specific project or task, and then they were disbanded. They were globally dispersed because their main driver was to attract talent across boundaries, talent that could be probably more economical, a bit more affordable compared to, employing somebody from the local context, or talent that simply didn't exist in the local environment. They were primarily inter-organizational. So this means that they were formed of people from different parent organizations. One good example here is the case of outsourcing, whereby somebody outsources a certain task of their work, and they employ people from a different parent organization for that specific task. And that group of people forms part of a virtual team. So they were inter-organizational. They were often purely virtual. So oftentimes we had the phenomenon whereby the members of the same team, they never met, or they only met face-to-face once. And everything, the entire life cycle of the team, took place in the virtual environment. They were largely office-based, although from different locations. So if we had a global team from 5 countries, maybe yes, they were dispersed, but they were working mainly from their offices. We had more stable membership, and we had high levels of heterogeneity or diversity, which means because of the global character of those teams, there were more cultures, more languages spoken, making it a little bit more challenging for the team to accomplish its tasks, but also more enjoyable and more effective for the reasons that we mentioned earlier, such as creativity and competition, developing a competitive advantage. In the current context, in which we are at the moment, we see teams that have been together for a long time in a face-to-face environment. So those same teams have transformed into virtual teams. It's essentially the same people, so they're permanent teams and polychronic instead of temporary. They are locally or nationally dispersed. So one organization that is based in a certain city and its employees were in the office every day, now they're still in the same city, but they work virtually. So that means that they are locally dispersed. They're intra-organizational mostly, because they are members, their teams are members, their members are belong to the same organization, and they're hybrid by default because they all have had face-to-face communication in the pre-COVID-19 era. So there's always some face-to-face work experience in those teams that probably took place before COVID, or now that we're slowly starting to go back into the office. They are largely home-based, the current virtual teams, because people were sent home to do their work from home instead of the office. And they're a lot more dynamic, which means that multiple people are members of multiple teams and they come and go before the end of the life cycle of a certain team. Heterogeneity and diversity are by default low because we're talking about people that used to be in the same office and probably they are from the same country and so on. So what we see here is that there are configurational differences in between the pre-COVID-19 virtual teams and the current ones. And this means that the newly transitioned e-leader has to take those differences into account. So what we did, my co-authors and I, is we developed, we conducted a literature review, and we identified 4 thematic areas that we argue should be the priority for the newly transitioned e-leaders. And these e-leaders are, and these factors or thematic areas, if you like, are digital well-being. So the digital well-being of VT members. The second one is engagement, trust, and relationships. The third one is work-life boundaries. And the fourth one is creative performance and innovation. So what our argument is that the newly transitioned e-leader should look after those aspects in their virtual teams. These are slightly different to the e-leader's responsibilities before COVID-19 in virtual teams in the pre-COVID-19 era. We're going to go through each of them in a bit more detail. So first of all, we're going to be exploring the issue of digital well-being. So well-being has been understood through the lens of the job demands resources model, which suggests that a balance should be attained between the two, between demands and resources. What we see in the COVID-19 context is that it is likely that we may be experiencing higher demands while working from home, whereas the resources are not necessarily higher. They may, in fact, be insufficient. The e-leader here should make sure that invisible aspects of VT work, such as, for example, DG Housekeeping, a new term developed by the co-authors in the authors in the citation below, or newly emerged phenomena such as Zoom fatigue, for example, that we hear so much about, do not impact negatively VT members' sense of well-being. It is likely, in other words, that there are factors that we do not necessarily see, such as, sorting your emails and clearing your inbox, or being tired because of extended Zoom calls on a daily basis, that they may contribute to experiencing increasing demands in terms of having to be present in an online meeting, for example, for a long time. So these are issues that newly transitioned e-leaders should factor in when they think about their team's sense of digital well-being in this context. This is the first thematic area on digital well-being. The second thematic area is related to engagement, trust, and relationships. So what we see here is that trust, for example, is a known challenge in the pre-COVID-19 literature on virtual teams. And it is also a prerequisite for effective VT working. In other words, you can't have a virtual team of members that do not trust one another, because that's going to probably lead to failure. Engagement is also a topic that has been studied recently in the VT literature, and emphasis has been given on the longitudinal, if you like, need for e-leaders to look after their VT members' engagement level. So this means that the leader's responsibility in terms of developing, helping, cultivating the issue of engagement in their teams is not a one-off activity, but it is something that has to happen longitudinally throughout the VT life cycle. The third point I want to make here is that relationships are paramount in the COVID-19 VT context. This means that the members of a certain team, they have to have social relationships between them or among them. The good news in the COVID-19 context is that those relationships pre-exist, so they don't have to be created anew. Instead, they pre-exist because the members that form part of a virtual team now, they used to be members of a traditional team, and they used to see one another in the office previously. So they have the relationship in place. So the challenge here is for the leader, or for the e-leader, or even more precisely for the newly transitioned e-leader, to ensure that those relationships are cultivated further. And in doing so, concepts like guangxi, which comes from the Chinese, from Mandarin Chinese, and involves issues such as promoting intra-team harmony, affection, and reciprocity, may be useful in strengthening those relationships in the long term. The third thematic area has to do with the issue of boundaries between work and life. As we all know, the COVID-19 context has blurred further spatial and temporal boundaries, which indicate where and when work takes place, essentially. So what this means is that when we work from home, those boundaries are significantly blurred. The family lockdown phenomenon, whereby when we have people, for example, that have that live with their kids and partners and maybe others, raises additional challenges in this regard. So it raises the additional challenge not for those who live on their own necessarily, but for those who have caring or homeschooling responsibilities, as an example. Third point here is that the conclusion is that we see exogenous factors that were not previously studied, and they were not previously there, but yet right now they influence how work-life boundaries can be managed. They make it more difficult, in other words. So the newly transitioned e-leaders should factor those factors in and adjust their practices to their virtual team members' personal circumstances, depending on how many people work on a team and what are their personal circumstances, and does an e-leader need to show a little bit more flexibility, for example, in relation to when exactly work is being done. Do we all have to work at the same time, or is there flexibility for us to work at different points in time during the day, or from different locations, as an example? So these are things that we need to take into consideration, and that the e-leader has to consider. The fourth thematic area is that of creative performance and innovation. So at the end of the day, doing work from irrespective of where you do it from, it has to be done essentially, and it has to be done creatively. And as we said before, companies have always tried to develop a competitive advantage in one way or another. So the aim is to do work that can lead to innovation for many businesses and organizations. So what do we know about creativity and innovation in this context? We know that creativity, which is step one for attaining innovation, takes essentially different forms at different stages of a project. So creativity at the beginning of a project may be something like being creative in terms of what tools to use to accomplish the task at hand. But creativity later could be about idea generation. So how many ideas can we generate? And that is a different form of creativity, if you like. So consequently, leadership practices have to be modified accordingly. So depending on what exactly creativity looks like, leadership should be adjusted to reflect that. And specifically, research has found that there are different leadership styles, e-leadership styles in particular for virtual teams, that work better essentially for different stages of the VT life cycle, or for the different tasks that need to be to take place, that need to be accomplished. The fourth point here is that virtual teams provide e-leaders with additional opportunities. This is one of the essential findings we have from the pre-COVID-19 VTs, the global virtual teams that we mentioned earlier, whereby one of the purposes was to attract talent. So since we work in virtual teams, why not be open about the opportunities that this may provide, and in terms of talent acquisition, for example, irrespective of geographical or other boundaries. So we shouldn't forget about the opportunities that virtual teamwork affords for e-leaders. We have seen the four thematic areas which we argue are essentially should be at the priority of today's e-leaders, of the people that transitioned into e-leaders because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But how do they relate with one another? So on this slide, we see that when we transition from traditional work into virtual working, the e-leader, which who is represented in the box on the left, the newly transitioned e-leader has a set of responsibility in front of them. We're going to go see this by explaining the meaning of the different arrows, which are not there to indicate causality, but they're there to indicate relationships. So the newly transitioned e-leader should encourage the development or the maintenance, if you like, of relationships. And that's shown with arrow 1. And we have here guangxi from Chinese, which shows that it may be something more than mere relationships. And that then gives rise to engagement and trust. It is likely that engagement and trust has a bidirectional relationship with relationships. So the more, the better the relationship, the more the engagement and the level of trust, and the more the engagement and the level of trust, the better the relationship. So that is shown with arrow 2, which essentially should have another arrow on the left, but it is for some reason missing on this slide. Arrow 3 shows that there are two completely new areas for the e-leader: the issue of work-life boundaries and the issue of digital well-being. So these are new because they weren't there in the pre-COVID-19 era. They're new because of the context that we described a few minutes ago. So what we see is that if the newly transitioned e-leader looks after all those aspects, then all these together, they have the potential to lead to creative performance and innovation at the end. So this is a model that my co-authors, specifically Professor Nikki Pantelli from Royal Holloway in London and Professor Robert Davison from Hong Kong, the City University of Hong Kong, have developed in a paper that you can see I have cited at the bottom of this slide, which is currently under review in an information systems journal. So based on the model, we have made some propositions for newly transitioned e-leaders. We have a general proposition and we have two specific propositions. The general proposition is that in order for practices by the newly transitioned e-leaders to be effective, they should be adapted to accommodate the additional challenges and characteristics of the VT configurations in the COVID-19 context. What this says essentially is that the leader has to look after additional areas compared to the pre-COVID-19 VT context. The specific propositions are that promoting relationships via Guangxi principles, for example, can lead to growing VT member engagement and trust towards the organization among the COVID-19 VT members. So this is about placing the emphasis on the relationship building and the relationship maintenance through the new principles that we discussed. The second specific proposition is that with increased digital well-being and work-life boundaries, the new areas that we identified, COVID-19 VT members will experience higher degrees of engagement and trust towards their leader and their organization. They will develop stronger relationships, and ultimately, this will lead to higher levels of creative performance and innovation. So this is the set. This is like the bigger picture of the model, if you like, in practical terms. What does this mean? What could actually newly transitioned leaders take away from this webinar? Here I have a list of recommended references, which I have used to develop this webinar. The first one is a co-authored paper on e-leadership. The second one is a paper that is currently in revision with a journal which we have obscured for anonymity as it is being revised and resubmitted. And the third one is a practitioner paper I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, which I have used here as well. The fourth paper is a book chapter written in 2020 that it's a summary of what we discussed essentially, but without the 4 areas. Then we have one about creativity and leadership, which I used to develop the 4th thematic area. There's a paper by Pantelli and colleagues on engagement in virtual teams, and there's a paper on DG housekeeping, which I used one of the slides on one of the slides as well. So this essentially summarizes what I had to say for today in this webinar, and I'm open to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for attending so far.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. As we said at the beginning, if you have any questions, please place them on the Q&A chat room that we have over there. Well, to start the Q&A, we have one question here. What, in your opinion, will be the future of work? Will it be virtual? Will it be physical? A combination of both?
Okay, thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everybody. That's a good question because it is a question that is being currently discussed in the media, and it concerns us all. My personal prediction is that the virtual element has come here to stay. So maybe it's not going to be completely virtual. So we're not going to be working in completely virtual, in purely virtual, as I said in the presentation environments. But there will be certainly more flexibility. There will be certainly more virtuality in the way we work. And the most likely scenario is the form of hybrid working, essentially. So hybrid working, which means we might be combining, certain days working from home, other days working from the office, essentially. But it's not necessarily going to be one or the other.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, we have another question here. Can traditional leaders be trained to work on this environment if they don't actually have the skills, previously?
Yes, so this webinar has been about leadership in particular, and the reason why we did this webinar is because leaders can actually be trained for that. It is understandable that there are very experienced people that have acted as leaders for a long time, and they have done so in a face-to-face environment, so they have significant experience leading teams, projects, organizations, but they may have found it difficult to transition, and they were not probably aware of the added challenges that we discussed. I think by placing emphasis on the new challenges, and by constantly assessing the situation we are in, because this is a very dynamic, we live in a dynamic environment that changes all the time, and by keeping up to date with developments, I think leaders, especially experienced leaders, but also younger people that may not have the leadership experience per se, but they may instead be very familiar with digital technologies and ICTs, so they may be able to bring that experience in. And either way, leaders can be trained, and this is why we work in a business school, I would say.
Amazing, thank you. Well, I think at the moment those are all the questions that we have for now. We can give them one more minute just in case someone is a little bit shy, and if you actually want to bump in, sorry for that, guys. And ask something, this is your opportunity to do it. And if not, as Professor Petros said, we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have in the near future. You can either contact us by email, watching the webinar afterwards on YouTube, or contacting us through our social media. We'll be happy to assist you.
I think
yeah.
I think we should draw this to an end. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I'm very happy to answer questions asynchronously or to be contacted again.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, Professor. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And thank you everyone for being here. As you know, at ESCP Madrid campus, we keep organizing a lot of very interesting webinars and events that they are going to be for sure of your interest. So visit our website and be sure to join us on our next event. It will be our pleasure to see you there. We hope you have a really nice afternoon today. Thank you, Professor, and have a really nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Hasta luego. Muchísimas gracias.